So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending today's discussion. One of the programs that DelDOT runs is called the Annual Research Program, and as part of getting this research program up to an improved level coming out of the pandemic, one of the things that our team wanted to start doing is to inspire a series of discussions and collaborations between DelDOT staff in different levels and different sections with as many people at U of D as we could, just to share ideas. And so this event today is the first of 3 this week, and we hope the first of several through the summer and through the fall. So as we move forward through this process, if you have any ideas or suggestions or comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Mike Duras in planning, as well as Jen Trunelli and Steve Bayer. We would be most interested to chat with you about any ideas that you have for research, for opportunities to have these kinds of discussions with someone at U of D. And so we are most anxious and optimistic to continue to improve the annual research program and overall the continuing relationship with U of D. So with that, I will hand it off to Mr. Paul Moser for today's discussion on Streetlight Data. Paul is a civil engineer in DelDOT's planning division with the local systems section. Paul has extensive experience with GIS tools and has probably gone further than just about anyone in the country with applying the level of traffic stress or LTS methodology for bike ped planning using an approach that was initially developed by Dr. Peter Firth's team, I believe at Northeastern. And Paul has incorporated the LTS strategy within an ARC platform application. And today's discussion is going to be on his experiences and background with the Streetlight data as a way of enhancing the LTS application. So I anticipate that Paul will have some slides and other presentation materials that will go for a half hour or so. This is a very informal discussion. So as we proceed, if you have any questions or comments, you can use the raise hand feature that's under the chat icon at the top of your screen. And we are recording this, so if you missed something the first time through, we will get the link out later this week where this will sit on the DelDOT YouTube channel. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'm going to share my screen just quick. Okay, everything look good?
Yep.
All right, well, hello, everyone. My name is Paul Moser, as Mike said. We're actually not called Local Systems Improvement anymore. We're called Active Transportation and Community Connections. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about this really interesting sort of mobility analytic platform called Streetlight Data. I didn't realize until earlier today how boring the title of this sounded when it was sent out. Streetlight Data Collection Challenges, what does that mean? So we're going to talk about a project that we're using Streetlight Data on and some of the analytics and insight that we're gaining from it. So the project we're going to talk about today is a study that was initially, or at least is conceived when Drew Boyce was still the king of planning. And we're just getting around to actually getting to the meat of it. Essentially, it's a study to examine the feasibility of a parallel cycling route to Route 1 down at the beach. As you guys probably know, it's very hectic down there. Traffic operations are crazy. And we usually have a bicycle fatality every year or two. Not every year, every 2+ years. Historically, they've been J1 travel visa students, which is very unfortunate. And, there are a lot of other accidents and injuries that go down here. So we do see it as a bit of a safety issue. But the challenge is there's really no other alternative to riding on Route 1 if you need to get to work along the Route 1 corridor. And even going north and south along here, it's not ideal, right? So we're looking, is it even possible in this mess of land use to fit in a parallel cycling route? Are there projects that DelDOT can do to connect existing roads, parking lots, whatever, to make it feasible? And then we're going to look at the access and directness to see if it actually presents a viable alternative for travel along Route 1. So, yeah, as I said, we're looking at all sorts of stuff. For those of you that have biked around Route 1, even people who are driving around Route 1, you probably know you don't always get on Route 1 to get up and down Route 1. There's a lot of parking lots and cut-throughs, and the same can be said about cycling, right? So we're looking for equally or more desirable routes than Route 1. Obviously, if there's a beautiful pathway that someone can hop onto, an eighth of a mile before Route 1 and get north and south to their destination and then get to their destination, that's fantastic. If there's a little bit of detour, some people will accept that detour and go for it. However, in literature on cycling and intuition of watching people cycling, you'll realize most people only have so much of a tolerance for detour. So if the route you're expecting them to use is winding and weaving and more than about 15% to 20% detour, people usually say screw it and just take the fastest route. Or they say, I'm not going to bike, I'm going to drive, or take the bus or walk because it just feels safer. So we have all these different project concepts. How many of them are actually feasible? I don't know. If I was a betting person, it might even be less than 50%, but we have a lot of ideas. So we're going to basically do some interesting modeling and determine which ones might be the most valuable. And if there's an alignment that's actually feasible, then come up with a prioritization process for choosing which projects to move forward as we develop this sort of parallel pathway concept on both sides of Route 1. So we're going to do that with some existing DelDOT travel modeling, as well as this cool thing called Streetlight Data that I'm going to talk to you about today. So what is Streetlight Data? It's not data about streetlights. It's actually a company called Streetlight Data. They are essentially, like I said, a mobility analytics platform. They buy and collect cell phone location data. So all of the different apps that you have on your cell phone, usually when you install them, you say, you have permission to get my location. Well, the people that get your location then package it up and sell it to other people, usually combined with other information they can get out of you, including where you live, your income, what you're registered to vote, all sorts of stuff like that, right? So we don't care about that. I have zero interest in that. What I'm interested in is where you begin your trip, roughly, and where you end it, roughly, what roads you're using, and what that trip looks like. So Streetlight takes all the other stuff out of the picture, turns this very messy data set of people's location API data from their cell phone. And as you can see in that second picture, figure 2 in purple, they sort of roughly figure out the linear trajectory of people's routes. And then the third one over, they actually compress those routes into sort of a roadway centerline model, a GIS sort of line network. So you can do very nice, tidy analysis on where people began their trip, where they end it, how long the trip was, their travel times, points of delay, and things like that. So they give Streetlight, this is the base product that they offer. But they also have a lot of other interesting tools, ways to dissect and analyze this data, and pretty much it's a pretty awesome platform. They started doing it for automobiles, but they have also opened a sort of bike module in the last 2 years. So Streetlight Data was pretty aggressive in marketing to us and planning for the last 3 years. And this project seemed like an interesting opportunity to take a look at it, particularly the bike side of things, but also the automobile side of things. So one of the core things to know about this is, as you can see, this is a really huge data set, and how you make sense of it really depends on how concise your questions are and what sort of way you can constrain it. So to constrain it, we're going to use these things called zones. So you can see up on the top is sort of the study area that we're interested in for this Route 1 study. It sort of goes from just a little bit north of Lewes, north on Route 1, down to about Dewey. And the zones, I'm going to call them, are the small little subsets of this study area, which are all shown in different colors on the top picture. Those are where we're going to look at where people begin their trips and where people end their trips. So those zones, they look a little strange, don't they? They were actually based on sort of the way that we aggregate housing for the bicycle travel model, which I'm not going to talk a lot about the bicycle travel model today. I gave a presentation to the winter workshop in 2021. The link is later on in here. If you want to learn about it, go check out that presentation. Will catch you up to speed. But what's shown on the right is sort of, like I said, the unit of aggregation we use for determining households for the bicycle travel model. So each of those little funny polygons, it's a different color, basically is what's considered the catchment area for each intersection. So every roadway intersection, we sort of see what are the closest houses to it. We count how many houses are in that catchment area, and we say, okay, 5 people live in this catchment area, 15 people, 20 people, whatever. And you'll see the colors are sort of related to, as the legend says, how many housing units are represented in that catchment area. So this is a way that we sort of, when we're saying we're looking at developing routes or predicting routes that people might bicycle, rather than look at every single house to every school, for instance, we just look at the nearest intersection and what that route is to the nearest school. So rather than having to do 20 separate routes for each house, we only have to do one because it's aggregating this way. So it creates these interesting polygons. They're called Euclidean tiles. If you're interested, it's sort of a pretty standard algorithm for geospatial tiling. And you'll see, because we use those for the bicycle travel model, we're then going to use them for this larger streetlight model. Not only because it allows us to sort of move back and forth between different geographies, between streetlight and the bicycle travel model, but we can kind of tune these to what the bicycle network looks like. So I didn't go into it, but we're using this terminology, as Mike Durrell said, called level of traffic stress, which sort of looks at roadways and their suitability for cycling based on how stressful it is to cycle on them based on your proximity to traffic. And that if there's a road that's very stressful or presents a barrier, that can create a disconnect in the network and sort of suppresses people's desire to actually cycle there. So these tiles are kind of based around that low stress network, right? So you can see there's one for downtown Rehoboth. There's one for the residential areas beside Rehoboth, the area south of Silver Lake, downtown Lewes, the greater Lewes area, the sort of Senators subdivision. We sort of broke it down to where we intuitively know and analytically know that there are breaks in this low stress cycling network. However, that was a little too much detail we found upon running the model. While Streetlight does have access to, they say about 60% of the population they have location API data from, that still gets a little finicky when you get down to these small geographies. And also for cycling, their sample size is not huge and maybe not perfect. So we decided, for the ease of working with this model to begin with, and to get a better sample size that was a little bit more statistically robust, we were going to beef up these areas and sort of combine and aggregate a lot of those sub areas. Because, I mean, you can see there's that tiny little section of downtown Lewes. And is that necessary? Maybe. Is it necessary to have 4 zones on Old Landing Road? I don't think that's necessary at all. So this is sort of, we moved to 13 zones for simplicity. And we've only just begun really using this for analysis. So we're a little early on here. You'll have to forgive me. I kind of had in my calendar, this was for July 28th. So I was hoping to be a little bit further along today, but we can give you an example of some data and some figures that we developed for a public workshop this past weekend. And I'll update you guys again, maybe some other time if there's a convenient opportunity. So the first thing we have to look at is, what do trip flows look like between these zones? Where are people traveling to and where are they traveling from? And maybe which roads are they taking? What does that tell us about the nature of cycling and driving in the area? So these are 2 maps that were developed. So these are looking at Lewes. The area shown in green is this greater Lewes area. It has the downtown, it has the section across the canal, and has that sort of suburban area as well. So this is showing, of all the people who came into Lewes within the study area, where did they start their trip proportionally? And that's what's shown in this map. So on the left is showing auto trips, so people who drove. Of all the people in this study area who began and ended their trip in this study area, where'd they come from? And you'll see it's somewhat, it's interesting. So in that automobile map, there are 22,000 roughly trips, like daily equivalent trips that occurred within this study area. This isn't including people who started the trip in Wilmington and drove down. They're excluded from this. This is just trips beginning and ending in the study area. So obviously there's more than 22,000 trips here per day. And to be honest, this is what they call their Streetlight Index, which I'm not super confident in. We'll talk about that later. So of those 22,000 trips in the Lewes area, 11,000 of them, over almost 50%, were internal to that zone. Again, how confident we can be in this data, I'm still trying to parse that out, but it's still a very interesting insight. So all the trips shown, all the percentage, the proportional trips shown, the 6%, 12, 10, whatever, that only represents 11,000 trips of the total 22,000. On the bike side of things, on the right side, you'll see there's only 1,500 bike trips using their Streetlight Index, about 65% of which were internal to the zone. So trips for people who weren't in Lewes coming into Lewes, the sort of, where they came from is shown here. You'll see a lot on, well, we'll just go to the next map, right? So that's 500 trips. So you'll see there's about 20 times as many vehicle trips shown and modeled as there are bike trips. Something to keep in mind when comparing these results. And this map is basically just a difference, right? So proportionally, how many red shows proportionally more automobile trips originating from that zone, and blue shows proportionally more bicycle trips originating from that zone. So what does this tell us? Well, the glaring one is that the trips to the commercial core, which we're sort of calling that commercial area that includes the outlets and in general the commercial Route 1, as well as a few shopping centers, significantly more by automobile, significantly. So that's pretty obvious, right? Depending on what kind of trip you're taking, if you're going to the outlets and buying supposedly discounted goods, you're probably not going to fill your cargo bike up and ride back to Lewes. A few people might, I doubt very many. And you'll see most of the places that had a higher proportion of cycling trips came from the Cape Henlopen area, Rehoboth, the area off Hebron Road, and where the Georgetown to Lewes path goes. So in a way, this is pretty intuitive, right? It speaks that a lot of these cycling trips are probably driven by recreation, but also possibly driven by accessibility by bike. That's a question we're hoping to get to in the next couple of days. But for right now, this is just something to think about. And the fourth one, which I was going to joke about, is Dewey has about an even mode split. So it might be a stretch to say that drinking and driving and drinking and biking rates might be approximately similar. It's the only joke you're getting today, guys. So we did the same thing for Rehoboth. What does that look like? Even more interesting. Internal trips within Rehoboth were only 31% of the total sample size versus 50. So the auto trips are much more leaving Rehoboth, occur a lot more externally rather than internal trips compared to Lewes. Cycling, somewhat similar. Again, about 66% of the bike trips occurred internally to Rehoboth. But more bike trips, a lot more bike trips, given a much smaller size. So let's take a look at that difference map again. Again, very similar. Way fewer people going to the outlets in the commercial core by cycle. A lot more going to those areas that are either recreational or have robust existing bicycle access. You'll see there's almost all of the places that require crossing Route 1 have sort of like a lesser mode share distribution. And one thing, again, I don't know how much weight to put in this. I'm tempted to put, I put actually very little weight in this, but it's still interesting. So if you looked at the total bicycle mode share, which is the total sample size, total vehicle trips, and total bicycle trips recorded internally and externally for both Lewes and Rehoboth, Rehoboth had a 15.7% of all trips were done by bicycle within the study area, whereas Lewes was about 7%. So again, don't put much faith in those numbers, but still something interesting using that Streetlight Index volume data. And again, the lower travel rates if you had to cross Route 1, still very interesting in my opinion. So here they are next to each other, these three diagrams. And then there's one on the right, which is also very interesting. I didn't want to bore you guys with more of these slides, but this is one we did for the commercial core of what I'm calling it and where those trips originated. And this is really interesting. In this one, the bicycle mode share is more closely related to proximity and access, right? So you have access, very high bicycle network access on the Hebron Road section. It's okay on that Munchie Branch section that shows 8.4%. And then also in this more northern commercial core, there's a lot more bike trips and this old landing zone for some reason. So another slide that I left out also looked at trip lengths, and we found that people who biked on Route 1 actually had shorter trip lengths than people who biked on other parallel roads. So really interesting insight there. And sort of one thing we're really interested in access to this commercial core. We're interested in people accessing Route 1. So seeing that the trip distributions for this zone was more related to proximity than anything else, we found very interesting. Again, not total causation, but this is early on. This is intuitive exploratory analysis. So before I go on, does anybody have any questions? I'm gonna sort of shift gears. So before I do that, any questions? Okay, let's just keep on
Paul,
going.
sorry, I just unmuted. It took me a second.
Mhm.
Do you know who is using or biking? Like, what kind of demographic? Is it like teenagers? Is it families?
Yeah,
Who's doing that?
Yeah, so we do have that demographic data. It allows you actually a really interesting cross-section. You can look at educational attainment, income, trip purpose, age, and I haven't gotten to that level of depth. Just doing the database gymnastics to put these maps together was enough of a pain. I can surely get back to you on that. Surprisingly, a lot of the demographics were similar for each of the zones, which is going to point towards one of the challenges that I'm going to point out later. But I think it was mostly I want to say it was mostly between 50 to 125,000 K income per year. It's skewed male. It's skewed towards high school and undergraduate educational attainment. And that's all I can remember. I
Okay.
can't remember age, but we can take a look at that sometime if you're interested.
Yeah, whenever you get a chance.
Okay. So this is a thing that's interesting. It's called a middle filter that Streetlight allows you to do. So it allows you to basically put what's considered a gate on different roadways and see for all of the trips that are being distributed to this area, who and how many people actually used that route to access the zone compared to anyone else. So this one is looking at the Lewes area and saying everyone else around, when they biked into Lewes, which way did they take? And I'll sort of point out these different ones. So Cape Henlopen is pretty high at about 46% of all cycling trips coming in there. Kings Highway, again, 25%. Georgetown to Lewes Trail, about 16%. The Junction Breakwater, 7%, and Savannah Road, about 3%. So I'll save my observations for the next one because they're similar. We did this again for Rehoboth. About 33% of people cycling into the zone came from Ocean Drive, which is what takes you to the Gordons Pond Trail. Rehoboth Avenue was a pretty close second, with Silver Lake Drive in the south coming up from Dewey, or other areas down there, the Forgotten Mile, for instance. Hebron Road, another big one. State Road, and Junction Breakwater at 0.3%. Okay, something is very wrong here and leads to one of the issues that I'm having with this data. I'm not convinced that they are accurately snapping trips to different pathways or even different roads in certain segments. For anyone that bikes in this area, the Junction Breakwater, though probably not as populated as this Ocean Drive, the Gordons Pond area, is not 0.3% of the total trips in the area. That's ridiculous. So I think there's some sort of spatial mismatch going on. And just to get to a couple of the issues that I've noticed early on. So I believe that some trips, auto trips under heavily congested conditions are being misrepresented as bicycle trips, especially through the commercial corridor area. Like I said, the bike trip flows between that commercial core seem unreasonable. And when we're using those finer zones, like I showed you before, we had the analysis with 43 zones versus 13. We had about 5 different zones that represented commercial areas, and those represented the majority of trip flows for cycling. So I think people that get in their car, drive 5 miles an hour through the parking lot, get on Route 1, drive 5 miles an hour on Route 1, and go to another outlet are being represented as bicycle trips using their algorithm. I can't confirm that because Streetlight's kind of a black box. So I'm just assuming whatever algorithmic magic they're doing is not up to snuff in that regard. And that error might even be similar in other instances, right? It's not just Route 1. I've also noticed using those middle filter analysis that some state arterial roads have a higher proportion of cycling trips than I would expect. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people bike on the roads, but more than I would expect. So, like I said, there's a disproportionate split on that beach loop as far as directionality goes. So I'm going to try and drill into these. I'm going to call their team here soon. One thing you can do, excuse my typo, is you actually can calibrate these streetlight models using your own existing count data. So what's shown on the right is automobile counts, right? And they have a pretty good correlation, right? But that doesn't necessarily address the actual scale of things, right? Just because you have like a good linear relationship doesn't necessarily mean that you're accurate. So the calibration could be helpful in increasing the accuracy of these counts. But I think for the automobiles, it's probably pretty good. It's the bike volume estimates that I'm hesitant about. Because the sample size is relatively small, calibrating with some user data might be beneficial for this project. So we're going to look into that. Between DelDOT and DNREC, I think we have about 5 counters around the area, mostly on trails, and maybe some temporary counts on roads. We're going to try plugging those in and seeing if that helps balance the network a little bit better. So, any thoughts or discussion on this? Anyone have any ideas about this or comments? Are you surprised? I wasn't that surprised. It's an expensive service, but I kind of figured there would be issues, especially with sort of capturing bike trips. It's not easy to do. It's really not easy to do. Unless someone's a genius there and has an idea that I can't even comprehend, which is probably the case. Okay, so moving on. So, oh, I heard someone make a noise.
Just a question. So you mentioned their streetlight sample size was low. Is there any case study that determines their sample size either for bikes or motorists? And so, like, can you share the numbers with us?
Yeah, so you can run scenarios sort of on the fly. It can take anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours. And they give you, like I said, when I say sample size, I might even be misusing their terms, right? I sort of showed this auto trip streetlight index as the sample size. I don't know if that's really safe to do. That's actually total trips. That's total daily equivalent trips modeled. So I'm sort of using terms improperly there. I think I can get a sample size from each analysis, from each run, but I might have to dig a little bit deeper. They do tell you some information, like some more meta data about the analysis, but it's a little bit of a black box. They don't really give you an extensive list of options or information about how they're deriving the data, how many people, for instance. So when I say I apologize for using the word sample size incorrectly earlier. But they do have some white papers they've published. Oh man, how about that? It looks like my computer froze, guys. So you have to give me a second to exit out. I'll be right back. Any thoughts on that while I'm coming back here? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. I'm sorry, everyone. My remote connection just collapsed, so I'm waiting to get back. So yeah, there is a white paper which I can send out to everyone that sort of explains their methodology and their validation. However, we have not done any of that validation in Delaware yet. We're just really kind of opening up this analysis.
Hey Paul, this is Mike. In your discussions with streetlights so far, does it seem like the Delaware relative sample size would be sort of above average or below average, or sort of the same as other areas? Did they give you any indication of that?
You know, really, The only discussion we had about that was when we were first kicking off the study area around there, and we gave those zones to a couple of their technicians there, and they said, okay, looks like you have a healthy sample size. They didn't give me a sense, unless I can go back to my emails and check. I don't think they told me how many per se, but they weren't concerned. The biggest thing was trying to right size these zones to get a good sample size. And they were a little skeptical of the small zones, but they said we could still do it. So my thought is when we round up these bigger zones, we're sort of in the sweet spot for them, especially for the bike thing. I think their big concern was biking. But it seems that we're working in a good zone, a lot of traffic. And again, these analyses were done in May through September of 2021. So by the way, can you guys see my screen now? Is everything?
Yep.
Yes.
You see me progressing through the slide?
Yep, you're moving.
Okay, good. I got kicked off. I was worried for a second there. Okay, so that's just interesting exploration of the data. The real thing we want to do is integrate this data into our existing bicycle travel model. So as I said before, I gave a presentation explaining the bicycle travel model at the 2021 DelDOT Winter Workshop. Go ahead and watch it. You might have to skip through a little bit till you find me. I tried to find a timestamp, but I couldn't get one in time. But basically, it's a model we've developed at DelDOT using this level of traffic stress methodology, which breaks roads in the scale of 1 to 4, 1 being perhaps a child cycling by themselves, 2 being most of the population, 3 being a more aggressive and assertive cyclist, and 4 being you'll bike anywhere, right? So we rank all of the roads, level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we see how well connected people are from their household, or those tiles I showed you earlier, to different destinations. And in this instance, we're showing it to employment centers. This is an interesting visualization where we actually show the level of connectivity. The green dot means you have high level of connectivity at level of traffic stress 1. Light green dot means level 2, orange means level 3, and red means level 4. So if you're up at level 2, 3, or 4, it means you don't have access at level 1. So, and orange means you only have access at level 3. So if you live in one of these areas with an orange dot, our modeling would say the only way for you to get to an employment center is by using a level of traffic stress 3 road or intersection. And same with a red dot. If you have a red dot, that means you got to get on an LTS 4 road to get anywhere. So we have this interesting way of assessing mobility from a household to different destinations. However, this is what I think Mike told me is called a supply model, where we're not looking at how many people are actually biking. We're just looking at how well connected your house is to destinations by transportation options. And in some cases, they're not connected, right? If you don't see a dark green dot here, that means you're not connected at level 1. If you don't see a light green dot, not at level 2. So some people just don't have good bicycle access to destinations. As you guys probably know, it's feels very unsafe to bike a lot of places in the state. But our projects can help with that, right? If we create a new connection, either a pathway or substantial bike lanes or other sort of countermeasure, we can lower that level of traffic stress and connect people at a lower level of traffic stress and probably capture more of the population who might not be comfortable cycling on these high stress facilities. So that's really the goal, to get new projects that connect people to destinations at a lower level of traffic stress. So right now we only look at supply, but we wanted for a while to look at demand. So when we build a new project, are people actually biking there? And then would that project potentially push people to cycle there more in the future? Or I guess more of an entice than a push. So right now with our modeling, we're looking at supply. Streetlight gives us the real mobility data to look at where there's existing cycling demand. So where are people already cycling? So just as an example, we'll look at this map. Again, this is sort of not a real methodology. It's just an intuitive explanation to get the point across. So the existing demand is where people are actually cycling at a high rate. So if we can produce projects that will improve connectivity between areas where people are already cycling, that's a win, right? Because we know there's already existing people riding there. They can benefit from improvements to the bike network. But then there's this more elusive metric of potential demand, of where are people possibly not cycling because the conditions are not conducive to it. And I find this one very interesting. This is off like Munchie Branch Road and some of the other subdivisions on Route 1. Quite close, closer than Rehoboth, right, to Lewes, geographically, but not from a low stress bicycle standpoint. They're quite disconnected. So this is an area where, you know, as I said before, not all trips are for cycling, right? But there is some subset of these trips that people are driving where it could actually be a more beneficial trip. Their travel times could be better. And, you know, it takes some traffic off Route 1 maybe. So we can use Streetlight Data, hone in on places, like I said, where there's existing demand and this potential demand. 2 additional metrics for prioritizing projects. Any questions on this concept before I move on? Does that make sense?
Yes, I have a question.
Mike, oh, go ahead.
For judging potential demand, are you looking at demographics based off of the current population that is already biking in the area? So let's say if the area has a lot of 55 plus neighborhoods in the area and it's shown as, you know, it'd be a high stress trip like an LST4 that would require putting in like a separate bike lane. But if everyone's, you know, 55 plus and in general that community is shown to be biking less, would it make much sense to, you know, put in the bike lane for that community specifically?
Yeah, so to some extent, we're not really drilling into that. I mean, a lot of people that are over 55 in this area love to bike. So we're not really drawing that level of distinction. To some extent, we're just saying, you know, what's the mismatch between modes, and is it possible that by further connecting them, that we would improve potential bicycle mode share? It is an assumption and it's sort of a simplification. One of the big axioms, I talked about that in the winter workshop presentation I gave on the bike network model, is that disconnects in the bicycle network, right, the lack of available options, is what we assume is driving lower mode share. Is that always the case? Probably not. But from a modeling standpoint, you kind of have to pick your assumptions and run with them. So we're just sort of not going to dig into it from that level of demographics or income at this point. There's plenty of people that like to do that stuff. I'm not really into it. I'm just more interested where the trip flows are and what's the network look like. So yeah, those are kind of the assumptions we're at. And I guess we'll figure out in the future, right? If we propose a project, people say this is a waste of time and money. Okay, we just won't do it, right? A lot of projects sort of die at that point.
All right. Okay. And I had, yes. And one thing I was thinking about is like if someone's coming from like out of state or out of the area, then they're going to the shopping centers. Typically, like for me, when I go down there, we won't, even though I bike a good amount, I won't take my bike to Rehoboth, the bike from one parking lot to another parking lot to Rehoboth, just because it's more of a hassle to bring my bike down than I had to worry about locking up my bike and everything versus just going to the area in my car and then just hopping around from parking spot to parking spot. So that's like really on the side of like parking and then having to deal with your bike and then getting back afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, are you saying like as far as chaining trips going, it doesn't make sense to cycle? Well, like I was saying earlier, there are a lot of trips that just don't make sense to bike, right? Like if you're going to the tanker outlets, unless you're working there, you're probably not biking. So yeah, this doesn't really get into the feasibility or the logistics on the individual. This is more of just sort of broad scale, regional mobility. But as I said earlier, this doesn't include trips coming into or out of the region. So this is only trips that are internal to the region. We're sort of thinking about these 3-mile trips as sort of the sweet spot for where a lot of people might be comfortable biking around here, and sort of trying to think of what are ways that we can make it feasible for them to actually get from their place, wherever they live, to a destination within 3 miles in a lower stress facility. But yeah, again, like the actual practicality of the trips is dependent mostly on the individual, not something we're addressing here.
Because I look at it as in a lot of trips come from outside initially, but then internally there's like a lot of traveling. So if I go down to Rehoboth for a weekend, I do like, let's say I go from Tandra Outlets, from one outlet site to another, and then down to Rehoboth for lunch, and then back to the outlets. That's internal to the area, but that's an external source of.
So the way they do it, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, if you get out of your car and you sit around somewhere for 5 or 10 minutes and you get back in your car and you go for another trip, they count that as 2 trips. So they had a lot of detail on when they broke up chained trips. So yeah, if you're doing that, your internal trips might be captured for sure, which is why I said earlier, I think a lot of those car trips are being misrepresented as bike trips between the commercial centers. I think it's exactly that. I think it's people who are stopping at the outlets and then going to another outlet and going to another outlet. And each of those is being counted as a separate trip. So I do think we get a lot of noise from that and some misattribution that might not be necessarily indicative of the real travel picture in here. You know, I do think that phenomenon you're talking about is being captured, and it's not fantastic
right.
from this standpoint.
And I guess, is there like some break point in speed between a bike and an auto trip? Or is it like, how did they judge it? Like
like I said, man, it's black magic. They are pretty proprietary and closed off about certain parts of their algorithm. I bet if I got them on a phone call, they'd explain it to me and I could tell you and update you. But yeah, I believe it has to do with trip speed, consistency of speed, and maybe acceleration characteristics. Right, because they're getting.
What device did they use to pick up the trips?
What's that?
What device did they use to pick up the trips?
Oh, the cell phone. Yeah, the cell phone right around wherever you are. They're constantly pulling data from those things, and they just get massive multi-million person data sets, and then sort of do this mobility analytic AI thing to get this data. So there's a good chance that you're represented in this data set.
If they're judging it, yeah, so without knowing what the black box is, it's like, I'm not sure if they're accounting for, let's just say, heavy traffic down like Route 1 on the weekends, then
yeah, exactly.
And everyone
totally.
looks like a bike or a pedestrian. So
exactly, that's my contention. I think that's what's happening. I think that is happening in this data set, and I'm going to meet with their support team to talk about that a little bit more and see if there's any way to mitigate that activity. Because just from what I saw between the commercial zones, it really looks like a lot of trips on these congested state roads. I'm looking at Savannah Road at times, some parts of Kings Highway. I think they're kind of calling them bike trips sometimes when maybe they're not. So we'll see. I'll try and tease it out and let you know if I figure it out.
okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, did I crash again? Everyone, don't do remote connections when you're giving a presentation. This is terrible. So any questions about that sort of potential demand and existing demand metric?
Hey, Paul, this is Nate Hard from DTC. I was going to say there's a lot of potential here, though, through other data sources that DelDOT manages, right, from traffic counts to trail counts to other things to try to kind of like validate this data, right? Like with modeling generally comes a validation stage. Have you looked into anything like that so far?
Yeah, so that's sort of on my plan for the next 2 months to actually go in and calibrate with the trail data. So they do give you an option to use permanent counters, use like an ADT metric. So we'll just come up with sort of a bicycle ADT from the counters. I was thinking about plugging in the automobile traffic counts as ADTs, but I took a look at that earlier, and I really don't think it would work because we're just looking at trips within the study area, right? But the ADTs are capturing trips from all areas. So I looked at Lewes, right? I set a gate on New Road, on Savannah Road, and Kings Road for automobiles. And the Kings Road Streetlight ADT was like 14,500, and the actual ADT was about 15,900. Pretty good. But relative to Savannah and New Road, they were just totally out of whack. my thought was because, especially Savannah Road was like 4,000 versus 15,000. So my thought is Savannah Road's getting a lot of this southbound traffic from out of the study area, and probably from Route 9. So it kind of falls apart in that our study area is closed off, whereas the ADTs are open to the rest of the universe. So the easy way to undo that would be just create a giant zone for the rest of Delaware, right? And just call that the external zone and have those trips coming in. So yeah, we could calibrate for automobiles. I'm interested in finding someone who wants to partner with me on that, because I'm not super interested in getting accurate automobile counts. I'm more interested in this sort of small study area thing. And then for bike trips, yeah, we're going to try and get DenREX data and DelDOT's data and do a little bit of sort of validation there. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Okay, cool. So the way we're going to integrate into the model, again, this, for those of you that heard me talk about this bicycle travel model, this might make sense. For the rest of you, I'm sorry. As you can see in the sort of dark black lines here, those are like the old streetlight zones that I was talking about. And then internal between that is sort of the polygons for housing that I showed earlier. The darker the color is, the more housing is aggregated there. So what we're going to do is, because the bicycle network model does these small little polygons, we sort of have to aggregate up. So if we model a potential pathway project and that shows connectivity improvements between two of these zones, we want to capture that. We want to understand, are we doing projects that are going to be increasing connectivity between places that already have existing bicycle trips and, like I said, potential trips. So the model will basically say, how well connected is this streetlight zone to this streetlight zone, using sort of the bicycle network parameters. And if we connect more of the population here to a broader section of this zone, we see that as a positive. Because I don't know where you're going with this zone, right? To some extent, we know where you live if you're coming from this zone, because the housing is, you know, your house is there, it's in county data. I have no clue where you're going within the zone. So because we lack that specific trip endpoint or that specific trip specificity, we're just going to look at global connectivity to these destination zones. So if you connect an area with a high level of population to a new sector of this zone, we're going to say, fantastic, you created new low stress connectivity. That's a good project. And we're going to do that with both the existing bicycle trips and those potential car trips. And hopefully run each of the projects and come up with sort of a nice little bar chart like you see below. That's going to say each of the projects, where does it stack up, right? Because we love these charts and we love to point at bar charts and say, this is why we're making the decision. So that's the end goal. This page is a bit technical here, but if you have any questions about it, or if you want to see it in action, please let me know. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll actually have a run of this, which could be excellent for the future, right? Because looking at bicycle demand using real probe data is very valuable. So Streetlight data is very expensive with the way we're using it now, but we might be interested in getting a longer term subscription. It determines if people see the value in this, and it ends up being like a valid method of doing this, because there's a million other ways we could use Streetlight. This is just my own little niche case. So thank you for listening to my little niche case. I think it's interesting, but there's a million more things we could do. So path forward, I still am working on some network tweaks, mostly about intersections to get it up to stuff. We're going to calibrate with the DelDOT DenREX bicycle count data. We're going to try to do the implementation of the Streetlight data into the bicycle travel model, QA/QC, get some snazzy maps, and then prioritize the projects in the study. So that is all that I have for you guys today. Thank you for listening. Does anybody have any questions?
Hey, Paul, I got one for you. If UD works jointly with DelDOT on a project, how shareable is the data, or do we need to be a separate licensee on a data set? That, you know, that is more often than not how it works typically, that we have to subscribe ourselves to be part of a research, to be part of a project with you all. Do you know?
Yeah, so we're working with Whitman on this, and they have one of their analysts who's using this data for the 5-point study. And they did have to sign a sort of a subcontractor agreement. I'm not sure what the limit is on that. I'm not sure if there's a limit on the number of subcontractors, the number of seats that we can do. So I can check on that. It might actually be like a partner thing. It might be like we'll see.
Paul,
Yeah,
we have another way to have folks share our license, but we can talk about that too.
Yeah, there also could be academic options too, but yeah, that'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah, Rusty, if we do end up moving towards getting one of those unlimited subscriptions, yeah, I'd love to have you guys be able to just go to town on it. That'd be really cool. Nate, I see your hands up.
Oh yeah, I put it up for the last question, but I was gonna maybe chime in with another comment. One of the neat things that is on Google Maps is that your timeline feature, and if you switch modes a lot, it is really interesting to see how your phone records the different modes, right? So you're sometimes you'll be on a slow bus, right, and it'll assume you're on your bike. Sometimes you'll be on your bike and it'll assume you're on a bus. Sometimes you'll be on a bus like the 301 that runs on the highway and it'll assume you're in a car. So yeah, the ability to get kind of reliable transportation data from cell phones definitely is a challenge. So if anyone's having kind of a little bit of a challenge kind of getting a picture of that, I'd advise you to go take a look at that and think like, hey, when was I on a bike recently, or when did I take a bus or something like that. So, but no, overall, a really good presentation, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting insight. And again, you don't get to see the nuts and the gears working behind the scenes. So, yeah.
Hey, Paul, it's Jen Sinelli. Just wanted to point out to anyone who is looking for planning credits, I posted the link to that in the chat. Jamie Whitehouse was able to establish planning credits for these lunch and learns.
Cool. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions about this, if you want to somehow get involved in this process, we just did a public workshop down at the beach on Friday and Saturday. It was great. It was pretty well received. I think only 3 people even bothered to look at this data. But, you know, it made it look like we were on top of things with our maps and our data. So that's a positive. If you guys are interested in this project as well, feel free to reach out to myself or Anthony Alio. He's the manager of the project. I'm just playing around, having fun. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for listening. I do appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks everybody for attending. We'll see
Thank
you
you
all tomorrow,
guys.
hopefully.